Good evening, everyone. I am Reverend Sherry L. Jackson, based in Alexandria, Louisiana. We are continuing our study in the Old Testament. This is our second lesson in the book of Leviticus. On last week, we introduced this book of Leviticus, and we admitted that it is not one that we readily go to. In fact, we skip over it. It's one of the books that if you try to read the Bible in a year, by the time you get to Leviticus, you kind of like get bored, and we kind of like get bored with it. And then that's when we stopped and said, well, the Bible is just too hard. And I admit, before I began really dealing and studying this book, I also ran away from it. But it is some golden nuggets in the book of Leviticus, because it taught the Israelites how to live. Remember, in Exodus 19:5 and 6, God told the Israelites that they were going to be his people, that they were going to be a kingdom of priests. They were going to be special people. They were going to be holy people. And so throughout the book of Leviticus, God is showing them and telling them and teaching them how to approach a holy God. And so because they themselves were not holy, God instituted a sacrificial system that allowed them to come clean, so to speak. In other words, they had to offer up sacrifices, not for salvation, because remember, they were already physically saved. We're not talking about a spiritual salvation here, but it had to do with worship and approaching God, So Leviticus deals with the progressive sanctification of the Israelites. The laws were God's will that showed them how to live and what is necessary for sanctification or holiness. The first section of Leviticus deals with how Israel was to conduct their public life, how they were to worship God. So in chapters 1 through 16, it deals with doctrine, it deals with teaching. And the last half of the book deals with application. So before they could apply, they had to learn. Now that's something for us right there, is oftentimes we just want to jump in something. We just want to just do, but we have to learn the doctrine. We have to learn what it is what it is we believe, how it is we are to approach God. And so this sacrificial system did just that. It allowed an unholy people to approach a holy God. The obligation for Israel to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation demanded that they be a unique culture. This was a unique thing for Israel that's going to set them apart from anybody else, from all of the other nations. God designed the offerings to teach the Israelites and to establish worship with him. Now, as we go through, we're going to see that there were 5 offerings. There were 5 offerings in Leviticus 1 through 7, and I hope that you had a chance to read that. Yes, it might have been boring and technical, but it's going to help you. But these 5 offerings in Leviticus 1 through 7 is to help us understand why Israel did what she did. And the Hebrew word for offering means to bring near, or that which brings near to God. So in order for the Israelites to come near to God, they had to offer up a sacrifice that made an offering to God that prepared them to approach God. So the sacrifice was a preparation to even get to God. And then not everybody could get to God. Only the priest would even be able to get, and that was only through Aaron's line, would be able to come through or come to God. The offerings taught the people what was necessary to maintain and to restore communion with God in view of their sin and defilement. So this sacrificial system that we're going to be talking about, first of all, we need to know is sin is what separates us from God. Sin is what separates us from God. So the sacrifice kind of like bridged that gap that allowed a sinful people to approach a holy God. God commanded his people to make offerings and sacrifices to atone for their sins. Now we're going to go over the 5, but each sacrifice had a particular purpose and actions depending on the particular person and the need. There are 5 major sacrifices within the book of Leviticus. 2 of the sacrifices dealt with commitment to God, and this was the burnt offering and the meal offering. 1 dealt with communion with God, and that was the peace offering. And then there were 2 that dealt with cleansing, which was the sin offering and the trespassing offering. And trespassing is also known as the trespassing. So guilt and trespassing is the same offering. Good afternoon, Pastor Green. Did you want to chime in before we get to talking about these sacrifices?
If I might, I hope I'm in.
You're in.
As you mentioned earlier, the sacrifice, the offering, there can be no offering without something being sacrificed. Something is given up. It costs somebody something, or it costs the life of an animal. It costs the burning of grain. It costs some bloodshed for somebody. Was the price to be paid for something. Now, whatever that something is that's identified in one of the 5 offerings, the methodology, the method, how, when, where, what, had to be followed to the letter of the law. That's so important that we follow the instructions of the Old Testament as to how the offerings were to be given, what it was to be sacrificed, who was to do the sacrificing, and how, even if it was the scapegoat, the hand would have to be laid on the head of something that was given. The fundamental piece that comes to me is, many times, I think we mentioned it last week or the week before, there are people who want to take the place and position of the one that God had put in place without proper training and credentials, and can put themselves in harm's way. And I think as we go through this tonight and looking at the different offerings, who is responsible for doing what, it could help us stay in our lane, as to say, and not want to assume the role of the priest, as did Saul. As we study his life, the first king of Israel, Samuel was too slow, so Saul decided he would offer the sacrifice, and it cost him his kingdom. So we need to be aware as we go through this that the offerings is not an atonement for sin. Their salvation was physical. It was a physical salvation, a physical deliverance to children of Israel from slavery. And yet God has given them the rules and regulations that needed to be followed in worship to prepare his people for his coming in Jesus. And I think as we go through tonight, it might help us to keep in mind we're looking at what was given to prepare the people, the kingdom of priesthoods, the Israelites, the Jews, Abraham's descendants, to prepare them for Jesus to come through that lineage. If we can see it that way and recognize that every offering costs something or somebody something, there's no such thing as a sacrifice or offering without cost. And so we may as well prepare, if we're going to live a sacrificial life, a living sacrifice, then it will cost us something every day.
Thank you so much. What we need to keep in mind is that God gave these regulations to Israel. Remember, he is still shaping them to be his people. And he's making a way. Let's just say this is a form of grace, even though that word has not, come up through this, so to speak, directly, but it's a form of grace that allowed them to be able to come close to him even before Jesus shows up. It's a form of grace that they would be able to do something. He just did not cut them off for sins or for being defiled or whatever the case may be, but he offered a way out. And that's the same thing with us. Jesus is our way out. And so what was involved in a sacrifice? There was the offerer. This is the person that's bringing an offering. This is the person that is bringing the goat, the bull, the grain, whatever it is. This is the person who is bringing the object to be sacrificed. And then there's the offering, which is an animal or other offering. And when we get to the peace, the grain offering, it's going to be dough, which is formed into a cake. It's the mediator, which was the priest. The sacrifice could either be, that should be soothing or sweet, or not sweet. In other words, depending on what kind of offering it would be, whether it was going to offer a sweet aroma or a not sweet, an unsweet aroma. There were 3 that offered sweet and 2 that offered unsweet. Then we'll talk about that a little bit more. Also significant to the offering was offerings were also, although they were offered to atone, but it was also a form of worship. The priest was involved. There was the sacrifice, and blood was always involved. As Pastor Green said, blood, sacrifice, cutting, dying, something had to die. And therefore, the blood was used to sprinkle as a cleansing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. But these are the things that are involved or significant when it comes to the sacrifice. So just kind of like in a nutshell here, and we're going to go over each one of them. Hopefully you can see this real good, that there's the burnt offering. That's the burnt offering. And then, okay, we want to make sure that we get on mute. We'll make sure we get our phones on mute. The burnt offering, and also offerings could be voluntary or involuntary. Okay, they could be voluntary or involuntary. Sorry about that. The burnt offering was voluntary. You also had the meal offering, which was the dough, so to speak, or it was it's dough. It was not baked, but it was formed into like a little cake, so you didn't have to offer up the individual ingredients. They kind of like put it into a dough at home before bringing it to be sacrificed, and we'll deal with that. And then also there was a peace offering. So 1, 2, and 3 were voluntary offerings. You did it when you thought you had a need to do it. However, 4, sin offering, and 5, the trespassing or the guilt offering, were mandatory offerings. And you see also the burnt offering was sweet. The peace offering was sweet, and also the meal offering, but the other 2 were not. And you can imagine why. Okay, before we get into the offering, are there any particular questions that you have on so far of what we said? And again, remember that these offerings were done to allow the people to get close to God. And then again, they were not going to be the ones to get, the priests were going to go in on their behalf. The priest is going to go in on their behalf. Okay, let's look at the burnt offering if there are no questions. And again, if you are new, I do know we have some new people online. If you do not want to ask your question, there is a way to send a question through chat, and we will try to see it and answer it for you. So the burnt offering. The burnt offering was made for atonement, for the covering of sins. It is the most common and the most important because it belongs solely to God. The priest offered a burnt offering every morning and every evening. And so if you read chapter 1, a burnt offering had to come from the herd, the flock, or birds. It had to be without blemish. The animal had to be perfect. Now, as you heard Pastor Green said, and I said earlier, although this is the Old Testament, the Torah given specifically to the Jews or to Israel, we can see Jesus, because again, Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice that was offered without blemish or without, Jesus was perfect without any sin, so to speak. And so the offering that they brought had to be perfect. Couldn't have no fungus, couldn't have no broke paws, no broke leg, no spot, nothing. And just think, when Christ comes back, he's coming back for a church without spot or blemish. And so there is a reason for God asking for a perfect sacrifice, so to speak, as humanly perfect as possible, because since the person could not approach God, this sacrifice of this animal will go on their behalf, so to speak. Okay? And it had to be perfect in order for the person to be connected to God. And again, they made it, this offering, every morning and every evening. Every morning and every evening. Just think, because people had problems, or or sins or whatever. This was a constant thing that had to be done. As we talked about earlier, this sacrifice offered a pleasing aroma. It offered a sweet aroma, a soothing aroma. And that said that this signified God's acceptance of the offering, and therefore acceptance of the one making the offering. Okay? It signified God accepted the offering, and that the one making the offering was accepted. God was happy and satisfied that the offerer had brought his best. They brought the male. Now, and we've talked about this throughout, even going back to the importance of the male was it had more value, it was physically stronger and more power. So bringing a female animal would not have been their best, because the female was not considered the stronger, and they wouldn't have had a problem bringing the female, but to bring the male was a sacrifice in itself. Okay, and so and remember, way back when in Egypt, the bulls and were prized possessions when we were dealing with those Egyptian gods. And so God said, I want you to bring the bull, bring your best when you come. Everything burned except the skin. So they put it on the altar, the fire consumed it, and everything burned except the skin. Now the skin was the outer, but the inside was the realness, so to speak. You know, we say that we use this flippantly, well, God doesn't look on the outside, he looks at the heart. Well, God does look at the heart. And so he says, yeah, that outside, I'm not wanting that. Bring me the inside, because that's where everything is. The seat, our heart, everything is contained on the inside. Now, I know we spend a lot of time preparing the outside, getting our outside all together, but we say it flippantly, but God really does know the heart. So he says, bring me the inside. This was an act of worship in which the Israelites offered to God a whole animal. It was involuntary. It was involuntary and a free will offering. A free will offering. Everything went to God. Everything went to God. Bring me your best. Bring me your bulls, your males. Now, the more a person had, the better, the more they had to bring. In other words, richer people would bring the best of the animal, so to speak, because that's what they had. And then the common people, so to speak, would bring what they had. But the idea was to bring your best. To bring your best. Pastor Green?
Reverend Jackson.
Yes, sir. Yes, you.
Maybe just for the thought, in addition to what you just said to us, is the burnt offering, and it symbolizing what its symbols were to God, is that the entire or total surrender of an individual or a congregation, where the whole thing went up in smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Completely except the outer, the high. And so it's saying that whatever I am or is, I surrender all of it. And it was to be sacrificed and burnt to ashes. And the ashes was to be scattered in a certain place. It's like it does not give atonement or forgiveness or salvation, but it does say, I surrender my will, my way to God. And so the picture here is when the fat of the animal, when the animal is burned, it's like downwind from a good barbecue. Oh, you know how far you can smell barbecue smoke from a good barbecue. If it's blowing downwind, it's like the neighborhood, somebody say, wow, somebody's doing something mighty good today. Well, it says it went up to God as a sweet smelling flavor that ascended into the heavens. And so the burnt offering here is like, whatever I bring, I give it completely and look for nothing in return. Mm-hmm. You know, some of us pay the tithe and give the offering because we expect something in return. We expect God to open up all the windows of heaven and pour out such blessing. But the picture here is, I am giving to God, giving back to God the best because I surrender my will to God. It is a total picture. And so when we study the burnt offering, look at the burnt offering, it's to know that when Jesus says, it is finished, the work is complete, the offering has been sacrificed, it's over. Is that how Jesus put it in right standing and right relationship with God? And so if there were some Jews or Israelites that were not in right standing and right relationship, they could not participate in the sacrifice. Or if some stranger was there who had not committed some notorious offense, the stranger could also participate. But the picture I want us to see and what you're saying to us is coming clearer by the day. The burnt offering is to say, I surrender totally to God. That's a powerful picture to come from the Old Testament for us who understand the New Testament somewhat.
Okay, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Make sure if you don't want to answer them, that ask them out loud, that you can go to the chat and ask the question by that medium, and I will see it. Okay, so let's move on to the grain offering. A grain offering shall be an offering to the Lord of fine flour bread. This is an offering of worship that brings God pleasure. It symbolizes the sacrifice and commitment of one's person and works, his body and property to God. So the meal offering followed the burnt offering, and it also produced a sweet aroma. It was both for worship and atonement. And what was so important for this one is that it had to do with the first fruits of your harvest or the work of your hands. So you are bringing in something that you have worked and toiled for, but yet you take the first fruit of it and bring it to God. Now, you also read that olive oil was a factor. They were to pour olive oil on it and put a frankincense on it. Olive oil was a symbol of God's enabling spirit. And so you, even now, oil, when we talk about oil in the New Testament, or even now, we see that as a form of a symbol for the Holy Spirit. Now, of course, the Holy Spirit, as on the day of Pentecost, was not active as like that. In other words, it did not, it had not come to stay. But the Holy Spirit did show up in the Old Testament, so to speak. It did the work and it left. It had not come to stay. But the oil represented the Spirit, and it transformed the flour. The people transformed the flour of the offering into a cake. So what they did was they used the oil to make, kind of like as a bonding agent, to keep the flour together. It was not baked, but in other words, instead of them having to bring all the different ingredients, what the people did before they got to the tent of the meeting to offer the sacrifice was to form it into a cake, so that they would be able to offer something whole rather than individual ingredients. Frankincense was a very fragrant spice, but the aroma did not become evident until it was put on fire. The oil and the incense made the offering more desirable and therefore more pleasing to God. Now, unlike the burnt offering, as Pastor Green said, which everything was given to God in the burnt offering, the whole animal was given to God. This offering was not. Only a handful of the grain offering was placed on the altar and burned, and the rest went to the priest. Not the offerer or the person who was bringing the sacrifice did not participate. It could not share in this, the eating of this offering, or it was between God and the priest. And remember now, the priests were the people who took care of the temple, so to speak. It's not a temple right now, it's a tabernacle, but they were the ones who handled the sacrifices. And so they got a portion, and they offered up God a portion, but the offerer did not get any of this sacrifice. Now this grain offering, the leavening agents it did not have any leavening agents. In other words, there was no yeast, so to speak, nothing to make it rise. Leavening agents were associated with sin, decay, corruption, sickness, and even death. And just think, bringing a leavening agent to this was bringing something from the outside into. And so this had to be as pure as possible to be brought for a sacrifice. And we say it was a baked item. It wasn't actually baked, but it was formed into dough in order to make it be consistent and not a lot of different ingredients. But it was unleavened. And remember, there was another time that we dealt with unleavened bread, and that was at the time of Passover. And even today, when we take communion, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, or whatever you may call it, it is unleavened bread. Whether you get it through the cracker or somebody makes homemade bread, it should be unleavened. It should not be any rising agents in it. Okay, the peace offering. The peace offering was to be offered to the Lord. They had to offer an animal from the herd. It could be from the herd, the flock, or goat. And again, it had to be without blemish. Now, the peace offering is also known as a fellowship offering. It's the third sacrifice of worship, and it represented the personal fellowship between God and each Israelite person that resulted from the relationship that God had established with them. This was also an optional sacrifice. They did not have to do this if they did not want to. The priest did not do this every day. because it was not mandatory. When there was a peace offering um, sacrifice, so to speak, it was more of a festive occasion. Now, a feast offering could also be a thanksgiving offering or a fellowship offering. Sometimes people would offer this as a thanksgiving offering for a particular blessing or something that God had done for them. It was also a sweet aroma. Now, unlike the burnt offering, which went totally to God, the grain offering, which was given to the priest and to God, this time in the peace offering, the person who brought the sacrifice, the priest and God were to share in this sacrifice. They were to commune with each other. Eating together had a significance in the ancient Near East. People who ate a ritual meal together often committed themselves to one another in a strong bond of loyalty. It symbolized fellowship. Eating together was more than just like people sitting at the table. It was a time of relationship. It was a time of sharing. It was a even a worship time, so to speak. So just think about when we come to the Lord's table, it is a fellowship time. It is a fellowship meal. We are all eating together. It is not just for the priest or the preacher or the pastor. It is not just for the clergy, but we are sharing in the meal together. This peace offering, they could invite other guests to participate in this. Because it was not mandatory. God also, this was also one of the feasts that they were to share in. So it was a time of celebration. It was a time of celebration. The offerer got to eat part of the same offering he made to God. Again, in the burnt offering, God got the whole sacrifice. In the meal offering, God and the priest shared the sacrifice. And in the peace offering, all three of them shared in the roasted animal. So again, this one was not a mandatory thing, but when people wanted to do this sacrifice or this offering, they could, and it was a festive time. All right, it was a festive time. Now that differs from the sin offering. That differed from the sin offering. It was not a festive time. Now, the sin offering was very important, and this offering was for unintentional sin. Unintentional sins. Now, all of the other offerings were for, I guess you would say, intentional sins. So what is that? What is the intentional sins? Those are the kind that you were just in total defiant rebellion against God. But the unintentional sin, whether it was by the priest, the whole congregation, the leader, or the common people, these were sins done by mistake, in error, oversight, ignorance, or carelessness. These were sins that were not, the other kind were called high-handed sins, like murder, any of those things. And again, just think about, I know we say, okay, there are no big sins, there are no little sins. For us, it isn't, but at this time, they had intentional and unintentional. So, we pray and say, Lord, forgive me for those sins I know I committed, and those sins I know I didn't know that I committed, so to speak. And so here, this sin offering was offered for unintentional sin. Now remember, the priest, when the priest sinned, he also represented this whole nation. He represented the whole congregation. And so it was not that the priest was not did not sin or did not have problems, but God had chosen him for a particular job. And so the priest had to offer up sacrifices for himself before he could even deal with the people. And so what I'm suggesting today is, although we sometimes want to put people on pedestal, particularly in the ministerial pastoral ranks, yes, God has called us to a different position, and he does expect more for us. But I'm suggesting that if we understand that even the priests, even the clergy are not perfect, and so it should not throw us so bad. But the priest had to deal with his own sins before he could deal with the sins of the people. And so this was a mandated offering. The most important feature of this offering was sprinkling of blood and the sacrifice. This offering was not a soothing aroma. It was not a pleasant aroma. It was to make amends. And again, the animal had to be without spot. It had to have no defect. The innocent animal substitute replaced the sinner. Replace the sinner. So again, Jesus is our sacrifice. An innocent lamb was our substitution, or replace the sinner. Replace the sinner. So again, we see Jesus all up and down this in Leviticus. So the sin offerings, the anointed priest had to have a bull from the herd, the whole congregation, a bull, the leader, a male goat without blemish. Common people could do a goat or female without blemish, a female lamb without blemish. So the higher you were, the more you had to invest, or your sacrifice had to be more expensive. And this shows that the priest had more responsibility. The more privilege, the more responsibility. The more privilege, the more responsibility. So he had to bring, the top of the line, so to speak, a bull. And he carried the sins of the congregation. Once he sinned, it impacted the whole congregation. And likewise for our clergy, or those who are in these roles today, it impacts the whole congregation. Pastor Green, you want to get in?
Please, if we noticing what we're saying tonight, remember that not only was the sacrifice that was the sin offering made, but there was also provision for a scapegoat, a way of escape, of how part of the blood was to be put on the mercy seat and the other part to be put on the goat. And one's hand was laid on his head, and how that it was let free, per se, to escape the sacrifice and go back into the woods, into the wilderness, where the other one was put on the altar. And so Jesus became our way of escape at Calvary, where he gave his life as a sacrificial or sacrifice for sin so that we may go free or have a way of escape. And so the soul that sinneth, it shall die. But we did not die physically. Jesus delivered us at Calvary. So not everyone who had the price of the animal, God still had made a way, whether you had pigeons or doves, or the poor had a way out as well as the rich. One could not say, I'm too poor to bring a sacrifice, or only for the rich. Everybody had to participate. And I think that's so important that we stop long enough to remember that nobody is too poor or too rich to participate in the sacrificial offering system. The more one has, the more is required. The higher one's status. We make a little statement. Now, I know y'all have heard it. You can't sit high and pay low. Well, it's simply saying, if you come to represent us and you have flock, then we expect the best one in your flock to be given as a sacrifice. If you don't have, then we expect 2 pigeons or turtle doves. But everyone had to participate in the offerings that was given. You also mentioned the peace offering, how that is a time of happiness, of joy, of bonding, of man with God, God with man with man, we with each other, participating in a celebratory way. And how when we come together, we need to remember who paid the price for us. It's much to be learned, much to be applied in New Testament doctrine and teaching from the book of Leviticus if we absorb it. And also remember, too, tonight, that the value that we place on the animal also represents the value that we placed on giving it to our God. But nobody was left out. Everybody. Whether you had to bring a female goat with unblemished, a lamb that was not blemished, a bull that was not blemished, turtle doves or pigeons, we still had to bring the best available and offer it to God based on God's term. And the offering makes a lot of sense.
And as you said, the good news is that God made a way for all of us. And I like to think that that's that grace that He made provisions for all of us to be able to come near Him or to come into His presence. No matter what we have, it's still equal. Even with the tithe system, we're not going to get into that, but the 10%, whether it's the dime or the dollar, is still equal. Because God made it that we could all participate. He did not leave any of us out, and that's good news for me tonight. The final sacrifice or offering was the guilt or the trespass offering. This offering is closely associated with the sin offering. It removed the guilt of certain sins that involve trespassing against God. And trespassing means going beyond the limits of what is right. This, again, was not a soothing aroma. It was not a pleasant smell. The Israelites were to offer it when they had wronged someone, either God alone or both God and humans. The offending Israelite had to pay restitution to the injured party in some cases. The guilty party had to restore whatever the victim of his sin had lost. So this was more about um, doing something against each other. Of course, God also, but it also was when you trespass or go beyond the limits of what is right concerning God or concerning your neighbor, you had to make restitution. You had to offer up a guilt or trespass offering. Um, and this brought you back into relationship, in mended relationships with God and with the neighbor. So again, these are the 5 offerings that God instituted for the Israelites, for them to be able to come near him. And again, the priests were the ones who actually went on their behalf, but they had to make the sacrifices. They had to bring something themselves. And as Pastor Green said, what they brought symbolized or was a good idea of what they thought about God. So if they tried to bring, and I'm gonna send you a video. I thought I would be able to play it tonight, but I don't know how it would look come across the screen, so I'll send it to you. They would ask, the priest would ask the family, the person bringing the sacrifice, a lot of questions, and they would inspect the animal to make sure that there was nothing defective, no blemishes, no breakage, nothing, that this animal was perfect before they would even be allowed to offer up. Is this yours? Why are you bringing it? There's a whole lot of questions that were asked. And so again, what does that say for us? How we approach God or what we bring to God gives a good picture of what it is we think about God. Do we bring our best? Or is it defective? That's something to think about tonight. So also we talked just a little bit about it last week, and I'll just go over it again because I wanted to show you how all of this applies to us today. How does it apply to the church age that we look in? How does Christ fit into all of this? Now, there was the offerings, but they also had 7 feasts or 7 holidays that they were to observe. One was the Passover, and you remember we dealt with that early on, that Passover, putting the blood over the doorpost. And there was also the Passover that Jesus had was with the disciples on the Thursday before his crucifixion. The unleavened bread represents for us the burial of Jesus. The first fruit was the resurrection of Jesus. The harvest, the descent of the Holy Spirit, and then there was 3 months of kind of like nothing. And then there was the trumpets, the gathering of the church. Remember, I told you last week that when the trumpets were blown, it symbolized that the people were together, that there was going to be some type of important announcement that was going to take place. Just like when the final trumpet sound for us, all of the church, all of us, we would gather at that time. Then there's the Day of Atonement, which is the second coming of Christ, and then the tabernacles. And as we go, we're going to talk a little bit more about these feast days, which are still celebrated within the Jewish tradition. I have a question. Where did all these flawless animals come from? They did this every day, correct? Okay. The people had animals. They had animals, and that they were to. And I'm gonna let Pastor Green perhaps give a little bit more. But in raising the animals, I suspect that some would be good and some would, would have problems. But when they chose to bring a sacrifice, they needed to make sure that they brought the best one. Not every one of these were done every day. Not every one was done every day. The burnt offering was done morning and evening every day, but some of the others were not done every day. Pastor Green?
Yeah, am I in?
Yes, sir.
Okay, one of the things to remember that in the herd, we talking cattle. In the flock, we talking sheep, goats, or lamb. And so when one is raised, and the primary work during those days were shepherds. So they raised animals. This was their work. This was what they did. And in every group of animals, whether they cattle, sheep, goats, hogs, whatever, there will always be some prize animals. If you ever see 4-H Club or the 4-H animals at the parish fair or state fair, when they have the fair showing, you always will see some animal that stands out. He's beautiful. His back is erect. It's long. It's full. There are no cuts, no wounds. They're not blind in one eye. The horn's not knocked off. It's like you go through your herd, painstakingly look through your flock, look through everyone, and you pick the very best prime blue ribbon bull. Your best blue ribbon, high dollar, and that's the one you bring to the priest to sacrifice. We give our very best. Many of us in this Christian era, we write the check that we owe the church before we pay the bills. Others don't. They tip God with what's left. But God does not have to accept our sacrifice. And some of us forget that our service, our gifts, our ability, our talent, and those who preach and teach must always remember, I must study, I must prepare, I must give God my level best, because I don't want to be in the same situation as the first two brothers. One gave that which cost much, and the other gave that which cost little. So, if you spend any time in the country, any time on the farm, when people or where people are raising animals, you can readily ask the farmer, show me your prize bull. Now, the reason, as was alluded to earlier, about the bull and his value, the bull was used for procreation. Procreation. And you could see many that looked just like their father, whoever was the breeder. And therefore, the female could bring one calf a year. One female, one calf a year. But one prize bull, how many calves could he father? There was the difference in looking at the value. How many calves will this prize bull deliver this year versus one that this female can deliver? And so it was value, it was money, it was cost, it was sacrifice. And whoever was bringing the offering had to cost them something. And when you get to the book of Malachi, I think chapter 1 and 2, where he said, would you bring your governor, the sick, the blind, the lame? Would you sacrifice that kind of animal for your governor if you was inviting him to a barbecue and lunch? So God wants our best. And I think if we look at a farm animal, look at a little bit go and Google some farm animals, take a look at prize bulls, prize calves, and see what they cost today, what they look like. and say, okay, if I was a cattle farmer, would I give up this bull to be burned up in smoke to God? See what the price of one of those nice Hereford or Black Angus Yorkshire would look like, or Charlotte. Look at one of those expensive prime bull, 1 year old, no blemish, what it costs in dollars and cents. And next week, just tell Sherry that's how much offering you're going to give to the online Bible study. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope that question was answered adequately. If not, let us know. We'll try to take a stab at it again. Are there any other questions?